I realize that when I give you evidence of God's existence and the truth of Christianity, for instance, that a man named Jesus years ago rose from the dead, his opponents couldn't disprove it, those who believed it were willing to die for it. I give you evidence of those things, and I draw the conclusion, given my philosophy of life, he's given historical evidence of who he is and that we should follow him. But given your presuppositions, you can't conclude that a miracle took place. You have to conclude what? Strange things happen in this world, and if we had enough information, we'd give a natural explanation to it. So, though I think that there is abundant evidence for God's existence, I also realize that you will never interpret that evidence in this way. You will always bring your naturalistic assumptions to the evidence and draw different conclusions. However, I don't think that's the end of our argument, because I think we need to compare your worldview to my worldview with respect to what's going on in our argument at all. How is any argumentation possible? And I'm going to argue now for the impossibility of the contrary. That is, within my worldview, I can explain to you why there is logic. In my worldview, I can explain to you why there is causality. In my worldview, I can explain to you why there are moral absolutes, why I believe that human beings are free and have dignity. But in your worldview, there couldn't be any logic. Why not? Well, matter in motion, that's your worldview. But logic isn't material and it's not in motion. The laws of logic are abstract entities. The laws of logic are not something you can touch. They're not physical. The laws of logic are universal in application. They're not particular, temporal events or experiences. And they're absolute. They're without qualification. And so within your worldview, there could be no laws of logic. Some of you who have heard some of my debates know that this is the approach I took at the University of California, Irvine, when I debated Gordon Stein. I said, in essence, your atheistic worldview doesn't comport with the laws of logic. However, debate, in the nature of the case, debate requires that there be laws of logic by which we evaluate arguments. Therefore, by coming to the debate, Dr. Stein, you lost. By coming to the debate, you affirmed laws of logic, but your worldview doesn't comport with laws of logic. And so what we are doing here, the debate itself only makes sense, what? Within the Christian worldview. So that's an indirect proof from the impossibility of the contrary. If what you say is true, we shouldn't be debating, because there's no laws of logic by which we debate. Last year, I debated another atheist at the University of California, Davis. And in that debate, I offered what I called the toothpaste proof of God's existence. I acknowledged for my opponent that no matter what evidence is brought up, he's going to interpret it in his atheistic way. All right? So I can give him evidence of miracles, evidence of this, evidence of that, and he's always going to try to naturalize it and strip it away of any supernatural character. I said, and you're going to give me evidence of things, like evil things that happen in this world. You may point to child molestation and say, how could Christianity be true if this happens? What he said actually is that he had relatives who died at Auschwitz. He said, was God asleep at the wheel of the universe when my relatives were killed by Hitler and so forth? He said, you're going to point to evidence like that. Now what am I going to do with that evidence? I'm going to say God has a morally sufficient reason for what he's allowed to have happen in history. Since I approach the evidence believing in God, I'll interpret it in that light, and I'll say God has a good reason for what he did, even if he hasn't told us yet what it is. You, on the other hand, will approach all the evidence, the miraculous evidence that I'll offer you, and you'll naturalize it, and you'll interpret it according to your worldview. But that doesn't mean that we're left in our two separate towers just to loathe each other. It's like, I can't get to you, you can't get to me. Because it turns out that everything you do, everything you say, every experience you have is evidence that you believe in God. Of course, this just bewildered him, and if you ever watch the tape, I think you can see this. It's just kind of like over his head. He just did not understand what was going on. But here's the toothpaste proof of God's existence. If you squeeze the toothpaste tomorrow and expect the toothpaste to come out, if you squeeze the tube and expect the paste to come out, I want to argue you're working within a Christian framework about reality. Why is that? Well, because how do you know that the paste is going to squirt out tomorrow? You're going to answer, well, because of past experience. But of course, past experience is not relevant to what's going to take place tomorrow, is it? Unless what? Unless you add this premise. The future is like the past. Now, has anybody ever observed that? Has anybody observed the future? Go back to David Hume. A few minutes ago we were talking about it. No one knows the future. No one's observed it directly, experientially, and no one knows what the relationship is between the past and the future. Therefore, whenever you expect something to happen based on past experience, you're assuming the Christian view of the universe, that God controls all things and keeps them regular. In an atheist universe, there shouldn't be any science. There shouldn't be any brushing your teeth. For all you know, the best way to, dental health is not to brush your teeth. You don't know the toothpaste is ever going to come out. You don't know anything about the future. But of course, atheists can't live that way, can they? Atheists must use the laws of logic. Atheists must assume the uniformity of nature in order to think scientifically. And atheists have got to live in this universe as though there are moral absolutes. I've never found a man yet who didn't give evidence that he believed in moral absolutes. Although you hear a lot of cheap talk about people who say, oh, everything's relative. You know the best thing to say to someone who says everything's relative? Say, even that? Even that statement is relative? When I was debating Dr. Stein, I suggested to him that the way in which a person might win an argument is by shooting his debate opponent. Maybe that's the way you decide who has the best argument, right? I pull out my gun, I shoot you, you're dead, I win the debate. Now, what's he going to say to that? He's either going to say, well, there are no moral absolutes, so I guess you have the right to kill me, in which case I win the debate. Or he's going to say, no, there are moral absolutes, therefore thou shalt not kill, you shouldn't shoot me, you can't win the debate that way. And then I'm going to say, well, then I win the debate anyway, because you can only make sense of that if there's an absolute personal God who says you can't kill people. So that's why I pointed my finger at him and said, make my day. Go whichever way you want, you're going to lose the debate. Atheists cannot make sense out of reasoning. They cannot make sense out of science. They cannot make sense out of morality. They cannot make sense out of human freedom. Stop and think about this. If what the atheist says about us as human beings is true, we're all nothing more but animals, right? We've all evolved from the primordial slime, and what a funny story that is, but we have another night to talk about that. And in this natural development of us as human beings, our craniums evolved too, and there's gray matter in here, and this gray matter is controlling what's coming out my vocal cords, out my mouth, and that gray matter is subject to the laws of chemistry and biology, physics. And therefore, what I say is just as predictable as a weed growing. It's just the laws of physics and chemistry and biology working their way out. If what the atheist says about us is true, we don't really have freedom to look at evidence and make a decision what to believe. We just end up doing what the laws of physics require us to do. And therefore, if naturalism is true, there could never be any reasoning that supports naturalism, because men don't reason. They're just white rats that are conditioned to operate the way they do and say the things that they do. And so the very debate that takes place between you and the atheist already assumes what? Human freedom and dignity. And that's what I mean by arguing from the impossibility of the contrary. A transcendental proof of God's existence can be put this way. And I'm going to give you the most general form of it. And then, as you can see here, there are many versions that you can use depending on what is relevant to your discussion or what you're interested in. The transcendental proof for God's existence is that without Him, you couldn't prove anything. The transcendental proof for God's existence is that without Him, you couldn't prove anything. The very process of reasoning, the very attempt to prove things, already is committed to the Christian worldview, not atheism. And if you were committed to the atheistic worldview, you would destroy the possibility of reasoning in the various ways that I've already illustrated for you. In the outline, I've talked about the transcendental proof from the concept of causality, the toothpaste proof. From the concept of necessity. Everybody uses the notion of necessity in their reasoning. But in a chance world, listen closely, in a chance world, is anything necessary? No, there's neither conceptual, nor empirical, or psychological, or any other kind of necessity. The concept of order. Now, these first three concepts, you notice, match the traditional proofs up in Roman numeral 4. First cause, conceptually necessary, and final ordering. What is the difference then between the traditional approach and the transcendental approach? This is the $64,000 question. I know it's warm, I know it's late in the evening, but tune back in. Give me just a couple minutes here, because you need to catch this. For simplicity, I'll just use the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument says that I have an experience of D which required something to cause it. We'll call that C. But C had to have something cause it, which is B. And therefore, there must be a first cause, which we call God. The first cause, God. Now, as you can see, in the nature of the case, this argument is making God out to be what? One more natural cause in the chain. Secondly, in this argument, I have assumed that the unbeliever can make sense of the relationship of C to D and B to C without bringing God into the picture at all. And I've criticized that approach to argument. What I'm now proposing is not that we make God one more of the causes in the chain, but rather that we look at this whole way of reasoning, the concept of cause, and say there could be no concept of cause if God did not exist. God is the precondition for the intelligible use of causal reasoning. If there weren't this God, we couldn't draw any causal connections between toothpaste and squeezing, stubbing our toes in pain, or smoking and cancer, or anything. It's the concept of cause that I'm arguing for, rather than God being one of the causes. And so the doctrine of creation is presupposed. It's taken for granted when we approach the world and our experience reasoning in a causal scientific way. Likewise, the concept of order already presupposes God as the designer. The concept of rationality was the debate that I pursued with Gordon Stein. The laws of logic presupposed not an atheistic, but a theistic worldview. How about morality? When Edward Tabish at UC Davis argued that he couldn't believe in God because then God would have allowed his innocent relatives to have died at Auschwitz, I tried to turn the tables by pointing out that if you take an atheistic approach to reality, you have no basis for condemning Hitler at all, because what one animal does to another set of animals is morally irrelevant. The very fact that you want to condemn Hitler already shows that you're using a moral approach to the universe, which you can only make sense out of in the Christian worldview. We've argued about freedom and dignity. I said if our brains are nothing more but matter and motion, then we don't have any freedom and dignity to make the decisions we do. And if time allowed me, I'd like to point out to you that anything you like to talk about opera, you like to talk about baseball, you like to talk about legal matters, you like to talk about science or industry or money, anything in human experience you like to talk about, it will turn out that the unbeliever cannot make sense of what he or she is saying without borrowing from the Christian worldview. The proof of God's existence is that without Him, you couldn't prove anything. God is the precondition for the intelligibility of all human experience and reasoning.